to be our keynote speaker, take us to the dinner hour at 6 o'clock. Tom is a double Tar Heel who got his undergraduate degree here, as well as a master's in regional planning. In between, he spent a misspent youth at Yale Law School, but we don't penalize him for that. He has one of the most intriguing personal career stories, which I think he's going to tell you about in his remarks. Currently, he's the CEO of Cherokee, which is a private equity fund that has raised over $2 billion, and they do a very interesting type of investment. They buy real estate in contaminated sites and then perform remediation. And there's a technical aspect to this. This is not a pure finance play. This has a sort of scientific basis. So, not to give away more of the story, let me ask you to join me in welcoming Tom.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here today. I thought I would talk about three things. One is, I'll talk some about Cherokee and what we do as a firm, how we operate. I will, and how it came to be, some of the history of that, because it could be relevant to some of the people who are early in their careers. And the other thing, I'll talk some about some of the deals that we're in. And there are a couple that are on my mind. If there are any that anybody's aware of and wants to ask any questions about, please feel free to do so. I'm happy to talk about any of them. And then, but I also want to talk at the end for a moment about some kind of life lessons and what I've learned, and what I think would have been important for me to have known a little bit earlier, perhaps. And again, because maybe some of that will be helpful to people who are at an earlier stage in their careers. I'm 63 this month, and I've been doing what I'm doing now since I was 28. So I don't know how long that is, but it's a long time. We have two businesses, two fundamentally different businesses. One is that we buy contaminated real estate. It is a relatively large business. And it's the one that people are much more aware of. The reason for that is because we talk about it much more. We don't talk at all in any kind of public setting about the other business that we have. We don't advertise it. We're thinking about kind of getting our website set up to describe it some, but it really never was set up as a business. So real estate side, private equity funds, we've raised a couple of $2.25 billion over the years, starting in 1998, and we've bought 550 properties in most of the U.S. states, most of the Canadian provinces, European countries, and we clean up contamination on those sites. Usually it's a chemical factory or relatively bad contamination, some landfills. We'll clean up the contamination, spend a fairly substantial portion of our total investment will be on contamination cleanup, and then figure out something to do with the land after that. I'll tell you why we do that, how we came to doing that. We also have a New Markets Tax Credit Fund. We're an allocator of tax credits, so the government has chosen different firms. Most of them are banks. We're one of them for us in the specific area of brownfield. So we allocate tax credits for new market development in areas for brownfield redevelopment. We don't do the brownfield redevelopment. That'd be a conflict of interest, but we allocate those tax returns, those tax credits to other people. And then we've made a number of one-off real estate investments just along the way, outside of our funds, when we didn't have a fund or when something didn't fit in the funds. The most notable of those is the Citrix development in Raleigh. For those of you who are aware of that, it was really the first project in the warehouse district, kind of kicked it off, at least the first after the the Contemporary Art Museum. And we bought an old site there around 2009 or 10. It was a brownfield site along the railroad. We redeveloped it and started building what was going to be our office. It was a small building, and we were going to be on one floor. We figured we'd find somebody else to move in the other floor. And so somebody, it became, so it would have been 40,000 square feet. That was the size of the project. It ended up 190,000 square feet, 187, I think, thousand square feet, plus a very large parking deck. Because along the way, someone in our office, J.T. Vaughn, knew that ShareFile, Citrix, was looking for office space. And they came and saw our office, which we had redeveloped in downtown Raleigh, the one that we're in, and said, we want something like that. And so we thought, okay, and they were going to move into our development, and over time they kept coming to us saying, make it bigger, make it bigger. We started construction, and we increased the size of the project 2 or 3 times after we had started construction of it. It ended up being a really cool project. I hope you have a chance to see it at some point. So those are some of the kind of one-off deals we do. On the venture capital investing side, or direct venture capital private equity business investing side, we've invested in around 210 deals. So I'm not exactly sure of that number. I'm still kind of mining the data because some of these are pretty old. And it was never organized as funds. It was just writing checks, just seeing something and just liking it and writing a check. And of those, interestingly, I didn't know this, but 70 are open now. We're in 70 of the 210. The first of these was in 1984. But you know, that's a really long hold period to be in a third of the total deals that you've ever invested in still, when the time span was 30 plus years. Of those, 20 were medical, which is kind of interesting. I don't know anything about medical stuff, but it has been a relatively material part of our investment activity, almost serendipitously, I think because of the region that we're in and because one transaction that I funded, I backed some entrepreneurs in a medical deal early on. And probably 50 were somehow environmental in nature of those deals. 20 were funds where we invested in some other fund. You know, we're investors in UNC Idea, SJF, almost all local funds, and in most of the local funds. And we do that to stay part, to be part of the community and to stay involved. Those are not really big investments for us. And obviously we don't have anything to do with those. We don't, you know, that's a passive investment. We give money to somebody else and they manage that. And of that 210, there are some transactions, maybe 20 or so, that would fundamentally be considered real estate. So you could probably pull those out. And you come up with something like 160 if you take out the funds, you take out the real estate. There have been some kind of nonprofit investments that we made as well. It was a business, but it really was a nonprofit. So that's the sample size that we're dealing with. The way this got started is when I was in high school, I was terrified about environmental problems, as were a number of people. This followed, you know, a lot of industrial development in America and serious contamination in some of America's cities. I mean, contamination like you see in China. Obviously here is much smaller because we're a much smaller country. But you know, cities like Cleveland, Chattanooga, Birmingham, Los Angeles had terrible contamination. And so everybody was worried about that. The message had a big impact on me for whatever reason, and I felt an intense sense of responsibility to have something to do with this. I read the book that Carol Folk talked about when she spoke, Limits to Growth. It came out in 1972. That would have been my senior year in high school. And anyway, it was a Malthusian description running out exponential growth lines of resource depletion and all kinds of other bad things. It didn't take into account kind of market forces, but directionally it made sense and was completely terrifying. My interest was global environmental issues or systemic environmental issues as opposed to local issues. So contrasting, let's say, climate change to parks, or plastics in the ocean to, you know, things that are more visual or of local interest. So I wrote an honors thesis here that related to environmental impact and industrial development in Africa. I went to grad school my 4th year here. I finished early. I had money for 4 years and stayed. Went to urban planning grad school because I wanted to study pollution, and it was the one place on campus where you could do that at the time. My focus was environmental planning, which really meant sewage treatment, landfills, power generation, water treatment. I got fascinated by bacteria, the use of bacteria for dealing with pollution. Such a fascinating thing that you could use this natural process to deal with something that was noxious. My long-term plan was to be an environmental lawyer. The law was really the focus of most important environmental developments at that time. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act were around 1975, so I was in college at the time. And graduated from here in 76, went to grad school in 77 in urban planning. I worked in Asia for a year on landfills, sort of the early waste disposal systems in Seoul, in Korea, which was a developing country at the point, believe it or not. And came back and went to law school. And I worked for 4 law firms. By the time I finished law school, I had a 2-year-old, and I worked all the time. So I worked for law firms during the year, part-time. I worked for law firms in the summer to make a lot of money doing it. And I couldn't stand it. It was terrible. I was doing environmental law, the thing I kind of teed up my whole career to do, and I didn't like it. So I thought I needed a plan B and I needed a job. So I vowed to interview every entity that came to campus in the fall of my 3rd year that was not in the law. It was a fairly thin set, right? This is a law school. But a few did come, one of which was Bain & Company, of all places, showed up on campus. I signed up for an interview, went in, and by some incredible stroke of good fortune, ended up getting a job at Bain & Company. To this day, I don't really understand that. I will say that it had the effect that I was the most appreciative person probably that they hired that year, thinking about how fortunate I was to be able to work there, given my sort of woeful lack of preparation for it. The other effect is that I had to work really hard because the MBA kids knew a lot that I didn't know, and I had to catch up, and that was really great. I was assigned to 2 case teams. This is a critical part of the rest of this story, both involving the steel industry. One was energy efficiency, cost reduction in steel plants. So what I would do is go into steel plants and meet with the people who are running the machinery and get their data and talk to them about how they operate the plants. This worked out well for me because all of my work prior to college was as an auto mechanic. So I was a very technical, sort of mechanical person, and you're in a steel plant where everything is technical and mechanical. So relatively speaking, relative to the average consultant at Bain & Company, I could understand what was going on, and I could talk to the guys in the steel plants. It was fabulous. And then came back and built statistical models to create best demonstrated practice analysis comparing the energy consumption of these different plants. Meanwhile, I was on another case team involving the same steel company, which was going broke as they all were. It was a corporate restructuring case. And the reason I was on that case team is because I was one of the few people there who knew anything about the law. And that turned out to be relevant to this. We had to figure out how could we reorganize this company, separate out different parts of it, spin off parts of it to other companies or sell parts. So that was my life. Half of it wearing steel-toe boots, half of it, sort of being a lawyer helper to this case team. One day I got a phone call. I was there a couple of years. One day I got a phone call, and there were 4 guys in North Carolina who owned a brick company, and they were planning to sell it. And they asked me if I would help them figure out a corporate structuring plan that would enable them to do that. They had a buyer, but it was complicated because they had some excess land, they had some surplus assets, they wanted to separate it into 2 parts. Well, guess what I've been doing? I've been doing exactly that thing, working at Bain. And the reason that they knew that and called me is because one of those four guys is my father-in-law. The company is called Cherokee Brick. So I did this analysis for them and handed it over how they could separate the business into different parts and sell it off. And they went off to sell it. But I'd learned a lot about the industry. Bain & Company had done some work in the brick industry as well. And the biggest problem that they were having, this company had $5 million in sales and probably $300,000 or $400,000 of income. And the biggest problem the industry had was energy cost, just like the steel business. And so I started thinking about how could you reduce energy costs in the brick industry. Coincidentally, right at that time, EPA put in regulations that made it illegal to pile up sawdust out back of a sawmill. So that was the disposal means that all the sawmills used. So these are people who take trees and turn them into boards. And they create an enormous amount of sawdust when they do that. And so what do you do with the sawdust? It's a waste product. And the answer was you pile it up out back. And so every sawmill, I remember this as a child, because we lived in the mountains, I lived in Lenore, where the Google plant is. There were a bunch of sawmills around. You'd see a huge mountain of sawdust, and often those mountains of sawdust were smoking. And the reason was because they were degrading. They were turned into methane, and they would spontaneously combust, and so they would burn. It was very peaceful. I mean, it wouldn't flare up. And after a while, all the sawdust would be gone, so it worked out great, right? You got rid of your waste that way. The problem is there was a lot of water runoff from it, not to mention the methane that it was releasing to the atmosphere. So EPA said you can't do that. They mandated that the sawmills take their sawdust and dump it in a landfill. Well, then it would just turn into methane in the landfill. I mean, this was really not much progress, but that was the deal. So my thought, which was not an original thought, there were other people who'd been doing this, 100 years ago, was to switch the fuel in the brick making process from either petroleum, either oil or natural gas, to wood waste. There was a big company nearby, the biggest brick company in this area, had 20 million revenues, 500 employees, and it was owned by a public company that was in Texas. I knew they were losing money, or I knew they weren't doing well, and so I called the main number for that company in Fort Worth, Texas, and I asked to speak to the CEO of the parent company, the public parent company that owned this relatively small, to them, brick division was in North Carolina. And I got him on the first call. Now it took 15 minutes of these telling my story to whoever else was in front of him, but I got him on the phone. I was in Boston. I said, I'm up here working for a consulting firm. I've been doing some research on the brick industry. I have an idea of how energy costs could be reduced in the brick industry. I know things are bad in the industry. I've been looking at numbers. And I would be interested in buying your brick business and implementing this plan, which I think could make it profitable. If you're interested in talking about that, please let me know. And I got all that out in 2 or 3 sentences quickly. And he was quiet for a minute, and he said, well, why don't we talk about that? And I thought, I was astonished. And I said to him, great, and I told him I'll pay you book value for your business. I said in the sentence, I will find a way to pay you book value for your business. The reason that's important for a public company is it would mean they could take something they were losing money on and sell it without reporting a loss. So I knew that. I knew that was relevant to them as a public company. And I said, obviously, or maybe not, but I don't have any capital, and so I got to figure out how to pay for this. I want you to know that before I come down there and meet with you. You can probably figure it out, but just be aware of that. Okay? And he said, well, why don't you come down here and talk about it? And so I walked in the door saying, I'm going to satisfy your need, your objective in this transaction. Long story short, 9 months later, they sold me their brick company, it's called Sanford Brick, for book value, and they financed 90% of it. 10% came from a local bank. So meanwhile, during that process, the deal for the other company blew up, and so for the little one. And so the buyer walked away from the deal. And so I bought that one at the same time. Put these 4 plants together, implemented the Bain & Company Best Demonstrated Practice Energy Efficiency Cost Reduction Process, and started building plants, started building sawdust equipment to convert these plants from using oil and gas to using sawdust. And eventually we did. We converted 3 plants, 3 of the 4 that we had, we converted to using sawdust. It had the equivalent, the CO2 equivalent reduction equivalent of 100 megawatts of solar. So just that one, that's 3% of the solar that's in North Carolina now. Of course, there wasn't any at the time, but huge CO2 benefit associated with doing that. It worked out that 40% of the cost of making a brick was energy, and we turned that 40 into about 10, and that was more than 100% of the margin. The company became profitable, and eventually I ended up selling it to a big company that I went to work for as the head of their brick division, and I later bought it back. I was in the brick business for 16 years total. I started 2 other businesses during that time period. One was an industrial material recycling business. So I looked at our clay. We were processing huge amounts of clay. I mean, the volume going through a brick plant is enormous. And I thought, well, what is clay? I mean, specifically, like chemically, physically, what is the nature of clay? You'd be amazed how little people in brick companies know about the nature of clay, because it's not a variable for them. It's fixed. It's a constant. They have to use that clay. So they take that clay, because that's where the plant is, and they figure out how to make a brick out of it. You can make a brick out of almost any clay. So I started talking to professors, ceramic engineer professors. What is in clay and what makes clay good or bad? And meanwhile, what industrial processes would be producing as a waste what would be our food, our ingredient, to substitute for the minerals that's in clay? You wouldn't believe what's out there. So eventually we had 40 different waste streams that we brought in. Iron, almost any kind of iron we could use. Iron filings, iron rust, from sandblasting steel and steel plants. They had slag, we could grind that up and make bricks out of that. We brought in kale and clay that was used as a catalyst in some processes, and then dumped after that. Sand, foundry sand. I mean, there are just all kinds of non-hazardous industrial materials that people were paying money to get rid of. So they paid money to us. There were times when we got to zero cost of goods sold in our bricks. Zero cost of goods sold. In other words, the revenues associated with, it's not proper accounting, but the revenues associated with the ingredients that we were using to make the bricks were equal to the entire cost of making the bricks. As a consequence, it was, ended up being a decent business, even though it's a lousy business. We found pollution on all of these sites, contaminated land, and we had to clean it up. So I found some professors at Virginia Tech who were soil bacteria experts, and I gave them money to develop bacteria for cleaning up pollution in the ground, oil, fuel oil. And that led to a business that was called Biosystems Technology, and then Cherokee Biotechnology. A couple of businesses. One is we grew bacteria, like in brewing vats basically, and we sold bacteria to the bioremediation trade. The other thing that we did is we started a company taking contaminated dirt, mostly in cities in the Northeast. We would rent a warehouse, an old warehouse, we'd get a tractor, and we would bring dirt into warehouses, contaminated dirt, and we would farm the dirt inside warehouses with tractors, using the bacteria that we grew that would consume the contamination until it tested clean, then we had clean dirt, we could do with it what we wanted. Strange business. I found a professor at UNC State who was researching viruses and DNA, and ended up backing her. That was in 1987. It was the second sort of outside funded startup. She was using retroviruses to, I mentioned this once earlier, but retroviruses to transfer DNA in poultry. It was a scary thing, but it was 1987 and we weren't thinking that much about it. It didn't work out very well in the end, but it turned into a DNA extraction testing company. So a company that had good technology for extracting DNA. And we actually built a business around that. I mean, it had a different name. It wasn't kind of part of Cherokee or our world. She and I, we were equal partners in it. I was the money, she was the brains. And it became a real business. Ended up having probably 50 employees, and ultimately was sold maybe 13 years after that. But that's the first time I ever sort of invested in someone else's business, really, not something that I knew anything about. So I had a little bit of money because we'd sold the brick company. When I say a little bit, I mean, you know, enough to buy a nice beach house. I don't mean a lot of money, but maybe 2 nice beach houses. But you know, this was not a ridiculous amount of money. It was a ridiculous amount to me, but not a huge amount of money. And then I backed these professors doing soil bacteria. I backed this professor at NC State. And I thought, well, this is a good thing to do. And I developed a set of principles at that point, right then. So I was 31, I don't know. And one is that I would never have like a portfolio or any sort of any money like anybody else would refer to money. Stocks and bonds, liquid assets, those kinds of things. And since then, it's been basically true that I've never bought any stocks, bonds, mutual funds, anything that's sort of liquid or traded, except in a 401k. I don't own any of that. I've never done any of it. 100% of any money that I ever had came out of any of these deals, I put in the next deal. And so my allocation to early stage venture or contaminated real estate, so that's a whole separate universe, but we invest heavily into that, is 100% basically. Another was that liquidity is not a good thing. Now everybody, and all these rules, you got to temper them a little bit, like no diversification. Maybe you ought to think about your age a little bit, but there are points in life where no diversification is a good thing. There are points in life where maybe it's a little bit risky. Liquidity. So everybody wants liquidity, right? So an entrepreneur starts a business, successful. They want to sell it and be rich, which means they want to have a lot of liquidity. They want to have a bank account or a stock brokerage account. They want to have a bunch of money they can get their hands on so they can spend it or look at it or whatever. So my vow was sort of no liquidity. The liquidity is in fact negative, and it is for many reasons. It has a huge positive, which it can solve problems. So I don't want to be too down on liquidity, but the problems are that the yields associated with liquidity are really bad, right? I mean, what can you earn on money that's either passively in the stock market or even more liquid than that? Let's say in a bank account, not much. But another is that you might be inclined to spend it. I mean, I'm serious. If you do not have the money, then you're much less likely to spend it on something. For most people, probably I would be in that category, don't have the discipline to make sure that doesn't happen. Another was cap one's burn rate. So people think if they have more money, then they should spend it. Problem I was just referring to. Or if they have more income, that they should spend it. And look, we're all kind of guilty of creep over time, granted. But what if you said, I'm going to sort of establish a lifestyle which is sane and rational and works for my family, me, but then that's it. I'm going to lead that lifestyle. Well, you end up with hugely more surplus over the 30 whatever years I've been doing this. You end up with hugely more surplus to do this kind of thing with. And then the other was giving. I have found that giving, philanthropic, sort of, charitable giving, is a wonderful, helps you establish a wonderful relationship with your money. That if you give it away, so if you affirmatively choose to alienate money, certainly material amounts of money. It really changes your mentality about your money in a wonderful way. It creates a sense of freedom relative to your money, that you don't really need it. And I think if you do that, you make more money when the dust settles. I'm absolutely serious about that. It's amazing to me how graspy a lot of rich people are relative to their money, because they don't get that one kind of concept. I'm going to talk about some deals, and there are two in particular that I'll mention. One is I was at a board meeting associated with this company yesterday. Was the analytical method I used for determining that I'll talk about it today. So I'm really pretty much indifferent about any of these, but this is a company that was developed by technology that was developed by a professor at NC State to use a wood waste product and chitin, which is seashells basically, or the not seashells, but the plastic-like material associated with shrimp or crabs. The shells are made of. That material, as those two wastes, have some really interesting characteristics. He does a lot of other stuff to it, but for example, they can be very effective absorbents, and they're effective absorbents with water that has a huge amount of salt in it. So there are these strange kind of industrial applications for this technology. So I backed these guys who wanted to start a business around that, somebody who was at NC State, and they improved the technology over time. My interest was diapers. So a diaper is a hybrid material, because a diaper has wood fiber in it, and it has a plastic powder. Okay, it has a polymer in it, and that's the absorbent. That's what makes a diaper just explode when it's exposed to liquid. They absorb a huge amount. It's not the wood fiber, the paper. It's this absorbent material. But you end up with something that's a hybrid, thinking about from a recycling or composting standpoint. It's two things. It's an industrial nutrient and it's a biological nutrient, wood and this polymer, which is used as the absorbent. So guess what? This material can replace that absorbent. And so that's what we're working on, and as well as a whole bunch of other strange industrial applications. Making gypsum and gypsum wallboard sort of flow better. It has on concrete, just a bunch of different industrial applications. We just signed a licensing contract with one particular user, and we'll see. But anyway, keep your ear to the ground. The company is called Tethys. I didn't name it. It's an unpronounceable word. I think it refers to some, Greek god. I'm not sure. But anyway, Tethys is the name, and that's an example of the kind of stuff that I really like. An analogous one is Biomason. Some of you are familiar with the company started by a woman here named Ginger Dozier in Raleigh, and they had the idea. Others have had it as well, that if you could use bacteria to grow basically calcium carbonate like a seashell, you could use that process to, in effect, pull carbon out of air and turn it into a rock, some kind of rock. What the rock be used for? About a brick, right? So that's why they came to me. So you take some sand and you inoculate the sand with this bacterial solution, and it grows a bone or a shell-like material around the sand. You grow the brick. It could be used for other types of substrates, sort of like a marble-like surface. We'll see. It's called Biomason. The other one I'll talk about, just because I've been asked to, is industrial heat. So it's a bizarre story, but in 2012, we were, the economy had turned back. Our funds were doing better after just getting crushed in the downturn. And we were coming off of a couple of big victories. One was the Citrix development. That was a huge deal for us. And we were contemplating developing out the rest of the West Warehouse District at that point. The other was one of the medical transactions that I funded. I'd been in the deal for 15 years or so. We sold we sold a minority position in that deal to a large fund. And so we were awash, relative to my life anyway, in liquidity. And I got a phone call from someone who wanted to talk to me about fusion energy. So I've always followed, new energy technologies, and I followed fusion, always, all variants of fusion. Somebody contacted me, and I thought, well, that's weird. Somebody called me back a little bit later. 30 days later, a different researcher working on fusion, and then 30 days later. So 3 people had called me within 60 days to talk about fusion. It was clear that something was going on, and there was a new kind of interest in this. And then I was talking to a guy that I know who's a genius, named Carl Page, who's actually Larry Page's brother, and he is a fusion investor, but very analytical and very smart. This is not a dreamer. And I said, lay this out for me, and he did, and convinced me that it's at least conceivable that there could be a pony in there somewhere. And so I worked very closely with J.T. Vaughn, who's a graduate of UNC, and J.T. and I were sitting around looking at this thinking, what do we do? Because if you think about it, it is an incredibly important environmental discovery. If it were to work, it would be the most important environmental discovery. If it were to work, it would be one of the most important discoveries, again, if it were to work. And I'm talking about some type of nuclear reaction which doesn't produce radioactive waste or release radiation. What if that existed? And there have been rumors or sort of, little, evidence of this reaction occurring many times in the past, but the problem has been replication. And so we thought, should we do it? Should we spend money on this? Because it would take a lot of money relative to us little guys. And I literally met with my family. I've never done this before. I've said something, but I have a very understanding wife, 40 years, and 3 great kids. And I literally met with them, or called them, as the case may be, and said, look, I'm thinking about doing this really weird thing. This will be unpleasant. There's a 100% chance this will be unpleasant. That it'll be a huge pain in the neck. This could be a huge amount of work at a time when I'm not sure I really want that. And it probably won't work. And that's this question, but it will consume a substantial amount of money. I just want to kind of, cogitate on that or discuss that or mull on that a little bit. And having the same conversation around the office. And we came away feeling that this was an important thing to do. Not because of any sense of confidence that it might work. That's an important concept. Because a number of people along the way have said, wow, you spent a lot of money on this, you must really feel good about it. I said, no, that's a mistake. Why would you assume that I feel good about it just because I'm spending a lot of money on it, right? I'm spending a lot of money on it because it's an important question. And by some, great good fortune, I have the resources to do it. And I'd rather be the guy who spent his money on that than the guy who spent his money on a jet or whatever the case may be. So we set out to find the leading fusion researchers in the country, and we met with basically all of them. We ended up backing maybe a dozen or so professors at MIT, in Japan, in Europe, different universities, Purdue, University of Illinois. So, a bunch of very credible, really smart people, most of whom have backgrounds in the traditional nuclear industry. And that was in 2012. It has been a long, long time. And in that time period, we have weeded out pretty definitively maybe 9 or so of the 12 or so that we backed. So is that good news or is that bad news? And we've successfully discovered 9 things that didn't work, or at least we're pretty sure they don't work. But there are a few others that are out there, and we're still pushing the rock up the hill. I would say that we feel okay, and it's okay in kind of a binary world, right? So it either works or doesn't work. So we're feeling, we will keep doing this. Standing in front of you is either one of the guys who figured out the riddle of fusion, or spent a lot of money trying to figure out the riddle of fusion, and I'm pretty good with either of those outcomes, actually. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what I learned from this process, or what, I don't know, what seemed to have worked well, or what I would say to someone else, you should do this if you want to do what I've been doing. And along those lines, I guess the first question that I would ask is, what are your attributes? Because I live in an incredibly chaotic world where we lose money all the time, things work, things don't work. It's very unusual. I spend 30 minutes, like 30 dedicated minutes to doing any one thing ever in my life. So it's an ADD world, and you need that kind of mentality if you're going to do what I do. And I'm highly dependent on people who are not ADD types. If it weren't for the accountants and the financial people that I work with, I'd be broken, laying in the gutter somewhere for sure. So it takes all kinds of people to do this kind of work. And I think it's really important people think about what are their personal traits. Being a mechanic is really important in my world. I mean, it's one of the most important things skills that I have, or that I apply in the work that I do, is that I can look at machinery, at technical things, and have some general understanding maybe of how it might work. Well, that's sort of a weird, narrow thing. Like, most people don't have that kind of trait. Maybe that's why I focus on not software type deals as opposed to hard science type deals, things that involve chemistry or physics. Other lessons, simple things really do matter, and they're greatly underrated in today's society. I think if you want to have a happy life, and if you want to, you can simultaneously increase your happiness quotient and improve or increase the optionality that you have in your life. That is the ability to have a number of different paths that you can follow. Maybe another word for that is freedom. By following some of these rules, and the most important of which is kind of what's your relationship with money, and it's like a DNA thing, or almost a philosophical thing. Some people really love money. Some people really don't care about money. Some people love to spend money. Some people love to save money. And if you really love money, or you really love to spend money, or you really love to save money, then you probably can't do what I do. So you have to be at a place where you use money as a tool, where it's a vehicle. You sort of understand the economic world, but the money can't be that meaningful to you, or else it's impossible to pull the trigger when you have to do that. This relates to debt. I see so many people who end up with so much debt because they were buying something, they wanted to spend the money that they didn't have, and that eliminates all your optionality. If you have a lot of debt, you're dead. The reason I could do what I did when I called that guy at the brick company for Bain is I saved 50% of my income when I was working at Bain. had a baby at the time. I mean, I was married and had a baby. I saved 50% of my income. We lived on rice and beans and drove a used car. So anyway, watching your sort of personal balance sheet in that sense and not spending a ton of money. This concept of being nice to people. Life is long and the world is round, and you just wouldn't believe over the years how many times you will see the same people, you'll see the same relationships, you'll benefit in some unforeseeable way from some relationship that you had or that you didn't even know that you had, because you chose at some fork in the road to be nice instead of not being nice to somebody. I could tell some great stories about that, involving people that I've ended up working with later in life just because of some serendipitous encounter. And I also think that if you're in an entrepreneurial setting or a startup setting or working in these little type businesses and stuff that we do, you really have to have a servant mentality relative to work and activities. That is, you have to affirmatively put yourself last. And you don't see that much in big companies, or sort of, if you look at the headlines, you don't see that much of that. But I think in the entrepreneurial world, you really do see a lot of it. People who are not trying to extract all they can from the situation. I think that it is in one's self-interest to do what I just said. That is, it is more in one's self-interest to put oneself last than it is to try to put oneself first, because that will end up coming back to haunt you. But that's a message that I think needs to be conveyed more and appreciated more. If you have freedom and you have optionality, then you can do things like buy a brick company, or figure out how to put a deal together to end up with a brick company when you're young and you don't have any money, or later in life, if you have some money, to choose to fund a bizarre research project because it's an interesting and important thing to do. I really encourage you to do that, and to do that when you're young. Society is very tolerant of failure, and I think it's in some circles it's a badge of honor. So people worry about risk. When I was 28 years old, had a baby, a wife who was starting law school, I had no concern about failure. In fact, I said at the time, I thought it was a 50% chance brick deal would blow up. The big one was losing $2.5 million a year when I bought it. And we barely broke even sort of the first year because we got enough of the sawdust system implemented, but it might not have worked. We were building machinery, it might not have worked. And I knew that, and I talked to the sellers about it. I said, look, we got 50-50 odds this will be successful. Well, it would have been sad, but it didn't matter to me. I was 28, I had a law degree, I could go to work at a law firm if I had to. So think about at early stages in your career when you can manifest or exercise that optionality. Youth helps. The last comment I make is that I really do believe that business is the most important vehicle or method for implementing almost all societal objectives. And I encourage you, whatever your interest is, for me it was pollution, but whatever your interest is, think about that in a business context. I wanted to work for EPA, that was my goal. I wanted to be an environmental lawyer. Look what happened, I ended up doing what I'm doing. But there's no question in my mind that our business activities have had a hugely greater impact on the environment than if I had been in a government or in an NGO kind of a setting. So for those of you who find business subversive, I was right there with you, and could not have imagined myself being in business when I was here. I encourage you to have that open mind about that subject. I'd be happy to answer any questions about any of this, talk about any of our deals, or
let's
any
give
of the
Tom.
other subjects.
Okay, we have some questions from the floor back there.
Hi, I just wanted to ask if you could speak to some of your failures and how you sort of turn those into positives for yourself.
So I mentioned that I sold the brick company, but then I bought the brick company back, and that was in 1987. And it was at a housing peak, and it's very, I bought back before that, I sold, and then I bought 3 more, all in one transaction, financed by GE Capital. Interestingly, this has led to a long-term, really good relationship with GE, and I'm going to get ready to tell you a really bad story, so there's a lesson in that. So this company, basically housing starts fell in half, this company crashed into a recession. The only reason that we survived was because we were making money in the environmental side of the business, the bacteria side of the business. And I had guaranteed $9 million of sub-debt that was underneath $60 million of debt to GE. And we had about $1 million of cash flow around the bottom of that recession. Every year for 5 straight years, housing starts dropped. And I would go to these people, the sub-debt lender and the GE, and say, guys, and I didn't get paid a dime for 4 years. I didn't buy an article of clothing for 4 years. I barely bought food for 4 years. I was so hyper conscious of just small amounts of money, anywhere we could save. And, when the dust settled, I ended up 12 years later, probably, this deal was out of a workout setting. Okay, so, it took 12 years. With a fabulous relationship with GE, we built a new plant, one thing led to another, and they actually asked us to stay in the deal. We were going to refinance or do, somehow exit from it. They said, no, stay in, we want to stay in as a lender to it. The sub-debt lenders to whom I owed all this money to, which is not a prayer of paying these people, at least at that time. And I would meet with them and say that, and say, look, hang with me, maybe the carcass will be worth more than if you blow it up right now. I use those people regularly as a reference to this day. So that was probably the most trying or the most emotional of them, because there were so many people. We had lots of employees, probably 700 employees, and they're all kind of looking at me, like, what are you going to do? But there have been some more spectacular, financial blow-ups than that along the way. Deals that might have been really good, but then we just totally tanked it, usually because of bad decisions on our part. I looked at the data, and I think it's right around 50%. 50% of the 200 deals, of course 70 are still outstanding, so who knows, lost some money. Maybe not all the money, but at least lost some money. So two ways to feel about that, right? I feel pretty good about that.
Are you still satisfied about the state of the environment?
Pretty much so. But what I worry about is not so much what other people worry about. I'm weirdly less worried about CO2 than I am about toxic materials. Just look at the amount of load. How much load can this ecosystem carry? Can all the different ecosystems that make up life on Earth? How much load of these weird, man-made materials can those systems carry? And no one knows the answer to that. That worries me a lot. Toxic substances and ocean contamination, plastic in the ocean, things like that. I find that pretty scary. CO2, look, you remember 350.org? Well, where was that, right? What are we at now? It starts with a 4, but somebody's probably out creating 450.org. And I'm not saying I feel good about CO2. Right now, the lowest cost sources of energy are not fossil fuel. So I feel really good about that. If regulation gets out of the way, I think we'll see very rapid adoption of alternative energy technologies. The battery plant that Tesla's building out in the desert will double battery storage capacity. I think solar plus storage will be cheaper than coal, in 5 years, something like that. Now, of course, it takes forever to kind of fold that in. I spent a lot of time in China. I've probably been to China 25 times in the last 5 years or so. And I think they will very aggressively adopt environmental practices. I mean, it's their biggest existential risk. So I think we'll see a lot of change happen. Now, whether we overran the cliff, beats the hell out of me, but I guess that's not pretty afraid.
Can I ask you another question? When you, the fusion scientists, do you require them to share their information?
I'm working on that. So we're doing a little bit of that. You know, most of them, not most of them. 75% of them love one another, and 25% of them hate one another. But yeah, they're professors, and I've spent a lifetime working with crazy professors. It's tough. Science type professors. They tend to be in their own worlds, and so it's hard. It would be my dream that we could take this information and kind of spread it around.
Tom, another question about industrial heat. Given your 70 venture investments and some of them mature companies, if you went to a board meeting for each of them once a year, that's a significant time commitment. Then given your main flagship enterprise, Cherokee, that's a big commitment. And then you've got your family, and I know you to live a healthy life, so you're giving something to that. How much is industrial heat taking from your time from other things, and how are you mixing it into those other responsibilities, given the fact that the payoff could be so huge? And given the fact that the payoff could be so huge, how do you keep from becoming obsessed with it?
Some would say I am. Well, I don't know. I mean, I realized early on, so we had a baby, and I was in law school, and I used to have a lot of hobbies, and I go camping and do all kinds of cool stuff. And I realized this is not going to work. And basically, from then on, the entire rest of my life, I mean, like as an example, I love cars. I've always been a car nut. I bought a car when I was 13, and I rebuilt it. I was always buying and rebuilding cars. I'm a car nut. And I realized this is kind of like an obsession. I'm going to be totally anhedonic relative to cars. I've never spent more than $30,000 on a car since I got married, or before actually, I guess, ever, except for my wife. But anyway, enough of this. So I just sort of said, I'm not going to engage on sort of anything other than family and work. Now, for me, the definition of work is very broad. I go to TED every year. I've done it for probably 15 years. I blow a week pretty much, going to TED, hanging out with people I know there, whatever. There are a few other things of that nature that I do. And that's in my work bucket, distinctly in my work bucket. The philanthropic stuff I do is totally in my work bucket. But I pretty much wake up in the morning, I start working, if this is work. And I pretty much go to bed at night, and that's when I quit working. And that's about all I do, other than interact with my family. And I think if you want to have a lot of leisure time, or you want to have a lot of hobbies or stuff like that, the wheels will fall off. There have been times when I spent 40 hours a week probably working on industrial heat, and another, I don't know how many, working on everything else. At this point, it's substantially less because most of the research is not being done in our shop. It's being done somewhere else.
Do you balk at all at the criticism that Cradle to Cradle has come under? We're trying to take sustainability and make it something that is sort of trademarkable almost.
Yeah, I don't like that. Yeah. So Cradle to Cradle is a concept that's developed by a guy, a very close friend of mine, Bill McDonough, lives in Charlottesville, and I spent a lot of time with him. He's a very smart philosophical thinker. He's pretty crazy. I mean, I'd say that if he were sitting with, don't get me wrong. And they early on, they're not business people, and early on they thought, well, we need to trademark this thing. It's like ours, it's somehow ours. And I've always felt that was a pretty goofy thing. Now, I was substantially responsible for pulling that IP out of their entity, Michael Brown Bucks, Bill McDonough's entity, into the Cradle Institute, and which exists. It's a great organization that has taken that certification, the Cradle product certification, has taken that certification and is developing it in a nonprofit setting. But I think it's a valid criticism. It's important.
One last question.
Washington Post reported yesterday that the Brownfield Redevelopment Program, EPA's Brownfield Redevelopment Program, and the chopping block for proposed cuts to EPA. Can you
I'm the guy who wanted to work at EPA. That's kind of my goal in life, and I have enormous affection in many ways for the organization. I was talking to somebody who's at Environmental Defense Fund now, who was at EPA her whole career before that, and I said, not regarding that specifically, but regarding the 2-for-1, announcement that came out, 2 regs have to be killed for every new one. I said, so how you feeling about that? She said, it's terrible, it's going to just destroy EPA. I said, so come on, I mean, is there anything? And she said, well, yeah, okay, maybe a little bit. I said, well, let's say you were in charge of EPA. Could you find 2-for-1, 2 regs per one to reduce? She said, oh yeah, if I were in charge, I could do it. Right? So it's sort of who's ox or oxen or whatever we're getting toward. I would, shouldn't say this in public, but I think if the brownfield program at EPA were going, it would make absolutely no difference in brownfield activity. Cleanup activity would have 0 impact on how many sites are cleaned up. 100% of all remediation that happens in this country is happening because of a private sector entity. And it's happening because they're mandated to do so by some regulation that says you have to clean up the site. If they said, that's the regulation, goodbye, we're out of here, and you better do it or we'll break it with the kneecaps, then people will do it. And so I'm pretty cavalier about that sort of thing. I really don't think it'll be a big problem if it goes away. I actually didn't know that was one of the ones on the chopping block.
Thank you very much for participating.